so far, given the way you understand and no, I don't remember anybody really giving me a whole lot with that one. So if anybody has some more, if they've thought about that during the week, I'd be glad to receive a comment or two about that. Anybody got one?
I don't think we even discussed it.
No, okay.
I'm not sure the question was really there, John.
Yeah, well, the question simply was, given your understanding of where a Bildad gets his information and where Zophar gets his information, how would you dress them in the play? If this is a play, how would you dress them? That's the question that I've got. It's just not completely a light question, because it's significant to how you see these people, it seems to me, to see what they're saying and why they say what they say. Anybody got anything to want to say about that?
The comment that I would make is their answers seem to be quite conventional and kind of I would say conventional wisdom, and so how you signal that in dress, I guess, would depend upon your society, but I don't see these people as fashion forward.
Might not come to LA anytime soon. Not good. Well, of course, obviously, the answer depends on whether you're going to do it in the ancient time or in the modern time and all that. Somebody did say last week, I remember, that Zophar sort of, I think it was Denise who Zophar reminded her of somebody like Joel Osteen, a kind of, slick, clever character with a beautiful suit and all that sort of stuff. And that may be the case in the modern world. The way I differentiate them, for myself at least, is that Eliphaz gets his information from his vision, which he has in chapter 4, which is a wonderfully written vision, I'd say. And then Bildad, I suggested, gets his information from the past. He is a scholar of the past, and he reads consistently about all the great proverbial wisdom that Israel has collected. And Greg is quite right. What they have basically said is very conventional stuff, which they have learned and known, supping at the trough of Deuteronomy, I suppose, in many ways. And then Zophar is a kind of rather more difficult, I think, to pin down. Certainly his knowledge is exactly the same as the other two, but I think the origin of his knowledge is more, I know I've literally sat in on the counsels of God. Either he is a mystic of some kind, or and he challenges Job to do that which he knows Job cannot do. And then Job, as we have seen, has responded to them in ways that are very angry and frustrated, and feels like he's not been heard at all by them. And he's quite right, he hasn't been heard by them. They are interested more in their own understanding of truth as they know it, and demand that Job agree with them. And of course, Job absolutely flat refuses, because he cannot agree that he has done anything worthy of the assault that he feels has come directly from God. Now, the other question I wanted to ask last week, which I did not, first Elizabeth, yeah. I've got you're on mute there.
So I'm saying what you just said about Bildad, reminding of his scholarly demeanor, made me think of a medieval university robes.
Yes, good, yeah, I like that.
Way back then, which of course our current regalia descends from.
Exactly, it does. That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So
colorful sleeves.
That I just envisioned him in that kind of garb.
Yep, that's the way I see him too. Exactly, with the PhD chevrons and
right.
Great mortarboard.
Twice a year.
Sure, of course, that's right. And of course, the people who really love those things, they walk around the campus all day with them on to demonstrate their brilliance and their wonder. Yeah, right.
All the time.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. That's right. They would love to be in England at Oxford, where they could wear these things all day, I suppose. Okay. Now, the other question I wanted to ask last week, we didn't really have time to ask, was, do you think, in what you have heard Job say so far, has he cursed God? How would you answer that?
I'd say he's pro.
I don't say he's cursing God. He's just sort of curious about, like, God, what are you doing?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
He's asking God to just leave him alone.
Basically, that's right. Sure. Get away. I'm tired of, let me swallow my spit. Yeah, right. What else? I mean, the line in chapter 9, which is always haunting to me in verse 22, is the one about God destroys both righteous and wicked and laughs while people die. You know, that's a pretty grim statement, to say the least. Now, obviously, you could say on the one hand that he doesn't use the word curse, but goodness gracious, to think that God is like that. If it's not a curse, it's sure in the world is awfully close to it, I would say. Anybody have a comment, make about anything like that? I mean, the reason I ask the question like that is because lots of times when you read commentaries on this book, I've said there are thousands of them. If you read commentaries, they often say, well, Job almost curses God. Job almost loses his faith in God, but he never loses his faith in God. I mean, this 50% even of significant scholars say something like that. And it's always struck me as being a bit too sanguine, a bit too simple, I think. Job is enraged because his entire understanding of theology has been turned completely upside down. And all that he can do, he thinks, is just to rail and to shout and to be furious. First at the friends, of course, for not listening to him. And then secondly at God, who he believes has attacked him, treated him like an enemy. One of the great ironies of the book is that the word Job, Hiob in Hebrew, is very close to the Hebrew word for enemy. And I've always wondered if whether or not the author didn't make that choice, as a matter of fact, but that's something else. Nancy, comment?
I was just going to say, Job is rightfully angry because he has played by the rules.
Exactly.
He has played by the rules and he's not winning.
That's right.
It didn't work out right. And he does not understand why, if he plays by the rules, he's still losing.
Exactly. And you know, goodness gracious, friends, I mean, we all have felt like this, and we all know people who have felt like this, who feel like their lives have been assaulted in ways they don't understand, when they have not done anything that you might call evil or bad or cruel or dark or anything, but they're just, something miserable has happened in their lives and they don't get it. So there are lots of ways to respond to that. And Job's response is anger, fury, rage at a God he thinks who is now treating him like as if he were some kind of beast or monster. And then so he turns it around and calls God a beast or a monster. Okay. All right. Anything else before we get a little bit into these other chapters now? We're in the second cycle of speeches. I have another question I want to raise with you now, and that is, if you had a chance to read this cycle.
Second, John, Becky has a question.
Oh, Becky, yes, please. Sorry.
I was just going to comment that he's still talking to God, and
yes,
he hasn't given up on God in some way.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a very important question, because in some respects, you notice something rather ironic about the book is the friends never talk to God at all. They talk about God a lot. They think they have God all figured out. And what they're going to learn at the end of the book is they don't. They simply don't. God's going to say quite directly in chapter 42, verse 7, "You have not spoken to me what is right, like my servant Job." That's a very haunting phrase to me. And I want to, when we get a couple of weeks down the road, I want to ask what you think that means. What has Job said that's right about God? But all of this is to say, you're quite right, that Job continues his connection to God, no matter what kind of connection it is. He's certainly not given up, and he never gives up, even toward the bitter, dark end of the cycle, the third cycle, as we'll see next week. He's still talking to God. He's still furious. He's still enraged. He wants God to answer. And God eventually will answer, of course, but in a way perhaps that Job didn't have in mind, but we'll say more about that. Now, the question that I want to ask you is, if you had a chance to read the second cycle of speeches from chapters 15 through 21, and the second speech of each of the friends, can you tell me what you see different in those speeches that you did not find in the first speech of the friends? This is a kind of a little, I would ask you to write a 25-page paper on this, but I'm not going to read them all. So don't do that. Just give me, do you have some answer to that? What's different in these speeches? Is there anything different in the speeches? Any response? Yes, Elizabeth.
Friends are getting more frustrated with Job.
They are.
Because he's not listening to them, and they're they're losing their patience.
Yep, they are.
And they're like, they keep insisting, Job, you're wicked, you're wicked, you're wicked. And he's not buying that.
Yep.
And so they keep stabbing at him and stabbing at him and stabbing at him with their words, which are becoming less subtle and are becoming much more, direct assaults on him.
Good. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, Elizabeth. I think they are certainly Eliphaz. If you read chapter 15, if he was the slightest bit subtle at the beginning, he's certainly not subtle now.
No.
When his phrases are things like, should they argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which they can do no good, you're doing away with the fear of God, hindering meditation. And he's really very assaultive now, quite directly. That's quite right. There's one other thing I think that's different here, however. Anybody else see something else? Shirley, did you have a comment?
No, I was just thinking about the figurative language and how much
Yeah.
they used agricultural references.
They do quite regularly. Yeah, it's interesting. I just a little note on that. The man I've mentioned to you several times, Robert Alter, who has translated all of the Hebrew Bible now in a very interesting translation. He is a poet himself and is a student of poetry. And his judgment about these speeches is that the poetry of the Friends' speeches is almost completely flat, with a few exceptions. They occasionally rip off a good line, but basically it's very pedantic, very ordinary, straightforward, and all of that. But the Jobin poetry tends to be much more lively, much more engaged, much more thoughtful in so many ways. And he thinks that's purposeful. Alter is a student of poetry, and really his comments are really quite extraordinarily interesting here at this point. And that's certainly possible. That's not quite what I'm after, though. Does anybody see something else? It's not obvious so much, and it's fairly subtle in its own kind of way. But let me just tell you what I think. In the first cycle of speeches, the Friends follow a pattern of poetic speech, which tends to begin with a kind of, Job, you've done something awful and terrible. But then they turn and they say, but if you will turn to God, if you will pay attention to God, then your ending will be great. And they've got all these wonderful phrases about how grand his life will be. In the second cycle of speeches, that completely disappears. They have no interest now in Job changing because they don't think he can change. And what they say at the end of all of their speeches, each one of them, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, is the wicked get what they deserve, and the descriptions they give are really quite grotesque. Wicked people die, they writhe in agony and pain, they are horrible, and on they go. And they've done terrible things, and God is now going to get them for it. And so they're saying this, of course, because here's Job sitting on an ash heap with nothing. And so they say, look, this is what happens to wicked people. There they are. They now no longer expect Job to change his ways. What they now want, they think that they can convince Job that he's evil and wrong by haranguing him now without any shred of compassion or hope. It's a pretty dreadful business. And if you keep that in mind as you read the first two cycles of speeches, I think you will see that the friends simply now, and I think the frustration level is very high, and they're not used to being disagreed with, I'm sure, any of them. And now Job is not having it. He's simply not having it. So I think that's sort of where we are now. What I want to do, obviously there are all kinds of marvelous phrases and lines in here that we could spend time on, but I certainly want to have time to talk about Job's turn to something really quite extraordinary theologically. Exactly where this comes from in the history of Hebrews, the Hebrew theological position, I'm not sure. It's a pretty remarkable thing. Now, remember what Job said in chapter 9, verse 33. If only, or would that there were, an umpire who would stand between us. He's speaking to God, of course, who would lay his hand on both of us, who would take away God's rod, so I'm not so terrified and I could talk to God. But that's ridiculous, of course. And then he goes back to his desire to be dead, essentially. But now in chapter 16, partly in response to Eliphaz and partly in response to this notion of a third figure, he's got another idea. Now, how does this happen anyway? I can only imagine, obviously, the basic claim of Israel is what? The central, if you will, creed of Israel is found in Deuteronomy. And what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is, it's that line that we all know, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord Yahweh is our God, the Lord alone. There is this notion that when the Hebrews struggled with who God was, there were certainly every culture around them believed in a pantheon of gods, many gods. Israel came up with this notion of one. And of course, it caused them no end of trouble. It's a lot easier to have multiple gods. You can always blame the bad stuff on that God as opposed to this one. But now you've only got one. But Job now feels somehow driven to think differently. And this is a very radical idea, if I am right, that this book is written in the exile of Israel sometime in the 6th century, well after this Deuteronomic claim about the God who is only one. Now listen to what Job says in chapter 16, beginning in verse 18. Now, unfortunately, some of this is very hard to read in the language. Not all of it, but some of it is. Certainly not the first part. O earth, he says. Now, this is at the beginning of chapter 16. There's a long attack on God. In verse 6, Job says, if I speak, my pain is not assuaged. If I forbear, how much God has worn me out, made desolate my company, shriveled me up, and on he goes, saying that God has got it in for him. God is attacking him. He doesn't know why, but God is. But now he turns in this quite extraordinary phrase, beginning in verse 18, and he says, O earth, do not cover my blood. Where does he get that from? There's a little Bible sword drill here for you. Where does it come from? Yes, Nancy?
Abel, where Abel's blood is crying out from the
Exactly.
ground.
That's right where it comes from. It's from that phrase. And I've mentioned this to you before, I think, but there's a marvelous pun in Hebrew that you can't really get into English at all. But it's a pun that works like this. The word for blood in Hebrew is the word dam. You transliterate it as D-A-M or D-A-M-M, dam. The word for human being is Adam. And the word for ground or soil is Adama. And so in chapter 4 of Genesis, when God confronts Cain with his murder, God says to Cain, what in the world have you done? The voice of the dam is crying, the voice of the blood of the dam of the Adam is crying to me from the Adama. That's the pun of Genesis 4. Job picks right up on that now and says, "O earth, do not cover my blood." Okay, now let's stop a minute and ask ourselves, what's he saying? How does it relate to the Cain story, according to Job? In what way does Job see himself like Cain at this moment, or like Abel?
No, I think he sees himself like Abel.
Exactly.
He's being murdered.
Sure, he's being murdered.
He wants to be avenged.
That's exactly right. He's being murdered, and he doesn't know why, but he knows he's getting it in the neck for reasons he can't understand. He wants his blood not to be covered over, crying out. It's that blood of Genesis 4 that cries out. Now, I don't know how many of you know, there is a long history of this business about murdered people speaking truth from the grave, often through their blood. Do you know the opera Porgy and Bess? Yeah, it's the same thing in that. When Porgy kills Crown in a bloody fight that they have, because Crown is after his woman Bess, and Porgy kills him. And Porgy is terrified, of course, that he's going to be found out. And he's going to be terrified because there's this supernatural notion that the murdered victim is going to reveal his murderer if you give him the opportunity. So that's why Porgy he doesn't want to see the body. He won't look at the body because he thinks he's going to be found out all the time. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were a group of people known as the Sin Eaters. You ever heard of them? The Sin Eaters were a group of traveling mendicants who went around this is particularly during plague years, in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in Europe, when the plague was so devastating to a third of the population, basically. The Sin Eaters would come, nobody had much of anything, people were terrified of dying, and many did. The Sin Eaters would come and claim that they could eat the sin of those who had died. So people would put food up on the bodies of dead plague victims, and the Sin Eaters would come by and eat the food. And they did it because that's the only way to get any food. I mean, everybody was starving. And so they imagined you got this supernatural notion that if I ate this food, then the person who had died would be free of their sin and they would go to heaven and would not go to hell, as so many of them felt they were going. So this idea of vengeance and blood coming back, appearing out of the soil, is rooted deeply in this ancient cultural tradition. And here is what Job is saying. Earth, he says, do not cover my blood. Why does he choose earth? What is earth here anyway? How do you hear him say it? Why is he appealing to earth?
Well, he's looking for a counterparty to God.
Yeah, he is.
Exactly. And so, now, again, how earth is a counterparty to God, but I think there's some notion there is that God is not paying proper attention here. So he needs to bring somebody else into this discussion.
Good. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good possibility, as a matter of fact. Anybody else? It's a very strange notion in some ways. The other side of it, of course, is that earth is sort of the oldest thing they know. I mean, earth has always been there. It was created at the very beginning in Genesis. The earth appeared from the great waters of chaos at the beginning of the creation story. And so earth is the oldest thing they know. So earth becomes a witness, a kind of evidential figure for Job. Now, this comes earlier on. We've got in our church at Westwood Church, what do we have outside? We've got Micah chapter 6. Everybody knows that. We all know that. Those of us in Westwood know that business about loving God, etc., doing justice, etc. But what that chapter begins with is earth as the jury, where Micah calls on the jury to argue on behalf of people so that they don't fall away from God. That is, the earth becomes the jury over against them. When people say, look, should I bring sacrifices to God? Should I bring rams, hundreds of rams and rivers of oil? No, says earth. You must love justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God. That is the same claim being made. Earth becomes a kind of living witness for Job. So he demands that earth not cover his blood. Let my outcry, he says in the second part of 18, find no resting place. The word outcry is the word tsa'ak in Hebrew. It always is used in contexts when some person has been assaulted or attacked and needs vengeance. And so the claim is one wants to provide a kind of evenness, a justice here. Job demands justice. He's not getting it. He knows he's going to die. He feels that strong. He said that to us over and over again. I know I'm going to die, but now I don't want this to be the end, though. I don't want just me to die. That's all. I want my blood to cry out. I want the earth to witness my blood. I want vengeance for the things that have happened. Even now, he says, look, verse 19, my witness is in the sky. Well, who do you think he's got in mind here? Who is this witness anyway? What do you think? Kind of a strange notion for a monotheistic understanding of God.
What if there's some kind of micro and macro understanding that justice is sort of baked in to the very being of everything, the very being of the earth, the very being of existence, that justice has some kind of, you can't tear it apart, that it's part of, it's baked into, and it functions in that way as a mover and a shaker of reality.
I like that. That's a good possibility, I think. Certainly the Hebrews had this clear notion. They probably got this from other cultures around them. Every culture in the ancient Near East struggled with this question, the question of balance, equity, all of that stuff. Every wisdom tradition of the ancient Near East was struggling with this question. The Egyptians, in some of their writing, has this thing they call ma'at. The ma'at is this thing that glues the universe together, a kind of force, a kind of thing that makes it possible for everything to survive together. And without it, the universe just flies into pieces. So the struggle here, I think, that Job is after, I think you're absolutely right about this, that he says, I know there's a witness. I know somewhere there is a witness who's going to be on my side to make this terrible thing that is happening to me available to others in order that others may not have to go through this as I'm going through it. The word witness in Hebrew is the word eiz. It means, I think witness is a good translation. It means somebody who is, again, an impartial observer who will give Job and Job's case against God the benefit of the doubt. That's what he wants. He wants some, but notice it's not just any witness, it's a witness in the sky. It's a translation in the RSV is heavenly. The word simply means sky. There's some witness up there around, available. If I know he's there. I know he is. And he that vouches for me is on high. Somebody on my side, somebody who's thinking about my case, not like these friends who, of course, are just assaulting him regularly. He's the one who's wrong. No, says Job, no. There's injustice being done here. There's injustice being done. Now, unfortunately, verse 20 is well nigh unreadable. The footnote, there's no footnote on 20 at all in the NRSV, and that's terribly problematic. There isn't any way really to understand quite what's being said here. You might say something like, the first line is particularly difficult. Exactly what it means, I don't know. And that verse 20, second line, my eye pours out tears to God. No, doesn't seem to say that. I don't know exactly what it says. So I'm just going to avoid that. I'm not going to make anything out of that, but I know what 21 says. And this is important, I think, anyway. What does this witness supposed to do? And here's the answer in verse 21. That he, the witness, would maintain the right of a mortal with God in the same way that one does for a neighbor. The metaphor is the courtroom, and the witness on my behalf, a character witness, if you will, is going to come and speak for me over against God, who has been attacking me for reasons I don't understand. Now, this, of course, is a wild notion in Hebrew reflection and Hebrew thought. But again, I would say that in the dramatic play that we're reading here, Job is so terribly angry and frustrated and confused that his imagination is wild. It drives him to these astonishing notions about witnesses and umpires and all that stuff. And surely many people who heard this, who would have heard this, would have been astonished by these phrases. What are you talking about? God is God, God alone. And well, yeah, but that's the problem, says Job. If God's alone, then God's the problem. And I've got to find justice somehow, and I'm not going to get it from God. I'm sure not getting it from the friends. So this imaginative craziness, if you will, comes out of him, umpires and witnesses. Okay. Now, Job in chapter 17 goes on to talk about how he kind of descends back into his sadness and his feeling of death, wishing he were dead and all that sort of stuff. He goes for that for a while. Bildad speaks in chapter 18 quite angrily. He's very, very affronted by the things he's heard Job say. How long will you hunt for words? And why are we counted as cattle? Why are we stupid in your sight? He takes this very personally. The things that Job has said, has claimed that the friends don't know what they're talking about. And they, of course, don't believe that for 1 second. They think, you who tear yourself in your anger, verse 4, shall the earth be forsaken because of you? So the rock be removed out of its place? Just because you're shouting and screaming the way you are, you think the whole world ought to change because of the stuff you're saying? Well, this is where Job is. He is at a point where everything he's believed is upside down. So he's driven, he thinks, to this claim that he must have some justice somewhere. All right, now we get to chapter 19, which in many ways is a very important chapter in the book. And I'm going to say some stuff to you now that you'll find probably quite horrifying, but it probably won't be the last time, but nonetheless, here we are. In chapter 19, it begins in the same way chapter 16 does, with a very long statement about how God is attacking him. It starts off even when I cry out violence, verse 7, the word violence in Hebrew is the word Hamas. I trust you've heard that word before. Yes, it's that word. It's the group known as Hamas in Arabic. It's the same word in Hebrew. The word Hamas in Hebrew is one of those words that talks about unjust violence. Violence against us is unjust, so we call that Hamas. And those who call themselves Hamas in Palestine, for example, now in the Palestinian state, they claim that they are being unjustly persecuted. That's why they've chosen this term as their name. Even when I cry out Hamas violence, I'm not answered. Nobody answers me at all. I call aloud, there's no justice. God has walled me up, stripped my glory from me, breaks me down on every side, kindle his wrath, and on he goes in this wild rant against God and God's assaults on his life and his person. And then he gets to perhaps the most famous lines in the book. He turns to the friends in verse 21, have pity on me, oh you my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Can't you see how dreadful my life is because of this assaultive God, which I can't understand and know? Why do you, like God, pursue me? Can't you be better than God? Job says. What amazing indeed. Never satisfied with my flesh? God seems insatiable to make my life brutally miserable. And now he turns again to another figure. And this is what's really interesting, of course, about this. And this part of the book has been long discussed and long talked about and has been a sort of central claim. So I'm going to spend a little time on it. We've got a little time to talk about this. Verse 23 of chapter 19. If only my words were written down. Well, of course, the irony is they are written down. You're reading them right now. But now that's not enough. Not just written down, says Job. No, if they were inscribed in a book, the word sefer in Hebrew does mean book, but of course it means scroll generally. It means to, if you've ever seen pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's what we're talking about. They are stitched together, long continual rolls of writing. That's the way the ancients wrote up until the quite later when papyrus became the basic tool. Many of the scrolls in Qumran were certainly written on papyrus, but some were written on vellum, on the hides of animals, lasting much longer that way. But look what he says. I want them written down. Oh, even a book. Yeah, that's good. But no, that's not enough either. Verse 24, with an iron pen and with lead, they were engraved on a rock forever. Job wants his case written. Now, the wonder of this is, and again, the author of Job doesn't know anything about this because it doesn't happen until 100 years later. But there is an inscription in Iran, still there, contemporary Iran. It's called the Bahistun Rock. It's in Western Iran. And one of the Dariuses, there were several Dariuses kings during the power of Iran from the 6th down to the 3rd century before they were defeated by the Greeks. One of the Dariuses had written on a rock and outlined in lead his name and his inscription, which apparently, I've never seen it myself, never been to Iran. Apparently you can read this thing from a mile away when the sun hits it just right. Because lead, of course, you can do it in such a way that it's enlightened by the light of the sun. And this is what Job has in mind. Now, I don't know where he got this idea. Didn't come from there because it's later than this, so I'm almost certain. But nonetheless, the idea is, first he thinks, how about a book? No, that's not good enough. I want my case written on a rock and inscribed in lead forever. I want for nobody ever to forget what's happened to me, ever. And now he says something really quite extraordinary. The New Revised Standard Version reads this in verse 25, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and they capitalize the word Redeemer. That, of course, is a translation decision because all Hebrew letters are capital letters, all of them. So when the translator does this, he's got something in mind. Now, clearly, what the translator has in mind is he is convinced that the Redeemer is God. Or later, of course, other people earlier on in Christian reflection thought the Redeemer was Jesus. This is what Handel's Messiah says, isn't it? The author of the libretto of Handel's Messiah, given in the 18th century, was a typical Christian believer at the time. And when he began the aria, I know that my Redeemer liveth, the third part of Handel's Messiah, his conviction was that Job was talking about Jesus Christ. Well, I don't think that's true. I can understand why somebody might say that looking backwards 500 years after this. I can see how they might find this a powerful witness maybe to the event even of this Redeemer. The footnote of my New Revised Standard Version, however, says you can also translate this word vindicator. And there is another way to translate it too, and that is avenger. And now I want to give you 3 possible meanings of this rather famous word. The word in Hebrew is goel. It's not an uncommon word in the language. It's used 40 plus times, I suppose. Its basic usage is in the book of 2nd Isaiah, from chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah. Now, if we had more time, I argue with you that I think Job and Isaiah are in dialogue with one another. Certainly 2nd Isaiah is a writer of the exile for sure. What he says is, I am the Goel, says Isaiah. Beside me, there is no other. Isaiah is strictly monotheistic and strictly convinced that the Goel is only God. And I would say to you that Job doesn't have that in mind here at all. Because the beginning of this chapter, as I tried to say to you, was all about God's attack on him. Suddenly he's turning and thinking that God is going to be his redeemer. I don't think so. I think that's just literarily ridiculous. Now, there are three ways to hear this, at least. One of them is, it might be another example of the witness that we saw in chapter 16. Maybe this is another heavenly figure that Job is looking for. He uses a different word here, he uses the word goel and not the word aith, as he did before. It's not the umpire either. It could be that. That's one possibility. It could be the redeemer of property, the redeemer who comes and straightens things out in a community kind of way. That figure can be found particularly in the book of Ruth. Ruth talks about the redeemer, the goel, who is Boaz in that case, who is going to straighten out the property problems that Ruth has. And eventually, of course, Boaz will marry her and they'll have the child who will eventually be the great-grandfather of David. All this is to say that it could be either that heavenly witness, or it could be the redeemer, a kind of legal figure to solve Job's problem legally. Now, both of those are possible. There is one other one, and it's a rather darker one. And I'm not arguing which one this is, because I don't know. But in the book of Numbers, there is a figure called the goel, who is the redeemer of blood. And here's how that works. There are, in the book of Numbers, a group of cities called cities of refuge. When a tribe is attacked by another tribe, if somebody from tribe B assaults and kills somebody from tribe A has the right to name an avenger of blood to get even. And the one who did the murder from tribe B has a right to go to the city of refuge to hide, to be protected from the avenger of blood. But the minute he steps out of the city, he's possible he could be a victim of this, to right the wrong. Now, the reason they did this, of course, is they were trying to prevent wholesale slaughter. They wanted simply one-on-one. They wanted, it was like Deuteronomy, I like to say, an eye for an eye. That's what they wanted. One person for one person, to prevent a war breaking out. That's how the thing was designed to do. But the avenger of blood was designed in the book of Numbers to get things even up again. Now then, is it at all possible that what Job has in mind by saying, I know that my Redeemer is alive, my Avenger is alive, does he finally want somebody to murder God, to get God off his back at long last and forever? Is that the only way that he can prevent God from this constant wholesale assault? Now, granted, that is wild. Of course it's wild. But I would argue literarily that Job has worked himself up into this wildness by continually believing that God is after him. And the friends are not helping him. And he feels alone and frustrated and terrorized and terrified and all those things together. And now he's moved from umpire to witness to divine murderer. Is it possible? And it's possible. I don't know. Might just be more of the same witness thing. I don't know. I'm just suggesting to you, it's a pretty wild notion, however one understands it. Now, the rest of the translation is not easy. I know that my vindicator, my avenger, my redeemer is alive, and that at the last, he, that is the avenger I trust, will stand on the dust, is what it says literally, actually. He will stand up at the last when things, all this gets shaken out after I'm dead, he says, after my skin has been destroyed, after I've been murdered, basically. And then, now here's the tricky part of this thing, verse 26. The RSV reads, then in my flesh I shall see God. Unfortunately, the preposition that's used there usually means without my flesh, not in my flesh. Implication. Job thinks after he has died, he is going to be able somehow to witness the gunfight at OK Corral and watch God get it. And whom I shall see, this is a wrong translation, 27, whom I shall see in my side. No, what it says is whom I will see for myself. not somebody else. And my eyes shall behold no other. My heart, literally my kidneys, is what he says, faints, recoils within me. I'm so excited about all this. I mean, this is completely bizarre. Of course it is. And if I'm right, if he really is talking about a murder of God here, it really is bizarre. I mean, it's astonishing. Now, would people in the 6th century in Babylon have heard something like this? I don't know. I can't say that one way or the other. Who would have heard the play like this? A few wild, crazy folks like Job's author? I don't know. But nonetheless, the point is that this figure in 1925 is certainly not God. I think that is a very poor misreading of what the text is trying to say. Job is urgent in his desire to meet God, to see God. And if he can't talk to God, which he doesn't think he can do, then he wishes God right out of the way. Just, I don't know what else I can do but move God away. Now, Zophar responds to all that in a very negative way, as you might imagine. And I wrote an article in a very obscure journal about 30 years ago, trying to argue that Zophar heard this chapter 19, just like I've described to you, and is reacting against that, saying that Job doesn't know what he's talking about. You think that somebody's going to stand up on your behalf? You're nutty as a fruitcake. No, it's not going to happen like that. You're evil, and you're going to get what you deserve, and you're getting what you deserve. And essentially, it goes on like that, on and on that way. And now, Job replies in a very dark speech in chapter 21, where he says, in effect, look, you guys have been saying over and over and over again that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. And I'm telling you, I don't see any evidence of that at all in the world that I live in. I don't see it. And he goes on in very great length here in 21. Listen carefully to my words, he says. Let this be your consolation. He's really sarcastic now. Bear with me, I'll speak. And after I've spoken, then just mock on any way you want to, he says. As for me, is my complaint addressed to mortals? Why shouldn't I be impatient? Look at me, be appalled, lay your hand on your mouth. These are stage directions, I think. Turn around, look at me in the face, lay your hand on your mouth, shut up for a while until I talk. When I think of it, I'm dismayed, shuddering seizes my flesh. And now he comes in verse 7, and after this, it's a long paean to the wicked being glad and happy. Why do the wicked live on, reach old age, grow mighty in power? And that it's his basic rejection of the friend's claims about reward and punishment. It's a long statement like this. Now, nobody can deny that to a certain extent, Job is right. We all know that there are really nasty people who end up in silk sheets and die happily trumpeted to their graves. We all know that. And we know there are good people who die much too young. We know that. So you can't say that Job is completely off base here. But of course, he's exaggerating everything, tremendously exaggerating everything, because his frustration level is so terrible and so high. The second cycle ends with these really quite terrible words. How then will you comfort me with empty nothings? There is nothing left of your answers but lies, falsehoods. So that's where we are at the end of cycle 2. It's a dark cycle. The friends have given up on Job's redemption. Job has done wild commentary about some idea of justice from some figure in the sky that he's not telling us who it is. And it's really on a very bad stage. And you can imagine that it might be a good time for God to show up. But no, I'm afraid not. There's a lot of stuff in between before God shows up in chapter 38. We're going to look at that next week. We're going to talk about there's a kind of a mishmash of stuff. Let me give you a slight introduction of that as I hope you have a chance to read it from chapter 22 up through chapter 37. Here's the way it goes. The third cycle of speeches falls to pieces. Nobody knows why. It just doesn't go the way it went before. Eliphaz has a typical Eliphaz speech. Job has a typical Job speech, and then things fall to pieces. Bildad has a 5-word speech. Job responds, but sounds a lot like one of the friends. There's no third speech of Zophar at all. And then you get this odd poem to wisdom in chapter 28, which we'll have to talk about a bit. Then you get a long speech of Job, 29, 30 to 31, where Job says, in effect, I wish things were the way they used to be, but they're sure not that way. And I wish God would come and talk to me. And then you think, oh, well, there's time now. God's going to show up. No, no. Then you get 6 chapters of this Elihu guy who sort of comes out of nowhere and goes to nowhere. We'll have to take a bit of time with that. It's not very good poetry, frankly, but nonetheless, and does he add anything? Well, I don't know. You can make that judgment. And then finally, our last session, we'll talk about the end of the book, of course, and it will all come down to that. How we understand what God says to Job will determine very much what we think this is about, what this book really is about. And so that will be in a couple of weeks' time. But next week, we have to kind of lead up to that so we can be sure that we know where we are. Okay, we've still got about 10, 15 minutes or so. And I wanted to leave some time for you to raise some issues with me, and I'm happy to have at it in the way I can. Greg?
John, I want to go back to this notion of Job appealing to someone or something or some idea above God. And another way of thinking about it is justice, is something just because God says it's just, or is there a justice that God supports because God is just? And so, you could have a notion as, one time in the Middle Ages, the notion was, well, the king is there because God put him there, and the king can do no wrong. Well, we know the kings do lots of wrongs, and so the notion that the king could do no wrong is an idea that needed to be murdered.
Exactly. Right. Good.
So maybe this avenger that Joel is talking about, this vindicator, is Job saying that the God presented by his friends needed to be murdered. That God needed to be gotten rid of, because that God was apparently not just, and that the real God, or the true God, or the God above God, or the witness in the sky was just.
Yes.
And so I think in this instance, Job considers justice more important than his friend's idea of God.
Exactly. That's a nice way of putting that, Reg. And I absolutely agree with that. In fact, you put your finger on one of the basic claims of my long ago dissertation. And that is the notion that this God needed to die. And my argument in the dissertation is that what the Job author was trying to do was to get rid of that God, so that you could think differently about God, so that you could have a different notion of God. This sort of mechanical God of reward and punishment simply does not serve well at all. It just doesn't. So I like your idea that what Job wants is justice, and he realizes he can't get that from this God. This God is incapable of providing that kind of justice to him. It's a very interesting way of putting that. And I think that's very possible indeed. I don't think it's the only thing, as we will see when we get to the speeches of God. But nonetheless, I think certainly part of what the author of Job is trying to do is to awaken people to their own theological confusions about who God is in their lives now. Now, I don't think this is such an ancient idea only, isn't it?
No, it's not. And to continue the dialogue, and here I'm really going to make a reach, but if you take the idea that we constantly create an image of God that we can understand, that we would want, that we would like, we project onto God our wishes for what God would be. I think one of the challenges that Jesus had hundreds of years after Job was the notion of the Messiah that many of the Jewish people came to look forward to was not what Jesus had in mind, or what God had in mind for the Messiah. So in the way that Job was trying to murder this idea of God that his friends had, Jesus' life and death on the cross was putting to death the notion of the Messiah as a conquering military hero that would come in and use violence to straighten everything out.
Yep.
So, our false ideas of God keep reoccurring.
Yes, excellent. I think absolutely right, Reg. I agree with that fully, and I think the notion that one of the tragic things about losing Job in the church and the synagogue, I would say, is this idea that the notions of God in the Hebrew Bible are not seen by many as being questioned all the time. People say about the Hebrew Bible, well, it talks about this God of war and vengeance and punishment and all that. And what Job is trying to say is that God is not the God we're talking about at all. That God is not the God I'm talking about. There's something different about God than that. And certainly when we get to the speeches of God, we're going to see a very different God, a very different portrayal of God, quite an extraordinary one, actually. Earlier today, I was on a Zoom with a bunch of priests at Notre Dame. And we were talking about the environment. Actually, they were responding to the Pope's encyclical of a couple of years ago, Laudate Si, which was his environmental statement, quite a lovely statement, actually. And I was trying to suggest to them that the book of Job was a superb resource for environmental conversation. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to show you that some more, I think. But this leads directly, as Reg has just said, to this interest that the God that the book of Job is portraying is simply not the God that an awful lot of persons imagine God to be, particularly those in the Hebrew Bible tradition, but also people now. I mean, this picture of God that one gets, this warrior deity who still is living in people's hearts in so many ways, is dreadful, it seems to me, and very dangerous. And I would argue that what the book of Job is trying to do is to get rid of that, to help us see differently, to open our eyes wider. In my long ago dissertation, I didn't really go far enough. I said that the basic claim of the author was to get rid of that God. I think there's much more than that goes on now. I understand the speeches of God rather differently than I did then, but certainly you're quite right. Part of what this author is about is to stop that kind of thinking. It leads to disaster to think that way about God. I think that's right. I agree. Okay, anybody else have comments or you want to make?
I think I need to tell you that I lose track of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Often, because of the tangents, you'll stick in a tangent from Ruth and then a tangent from another, and I'm sure it's all relevant. But at my age, I have a hard time coming back to the thread.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. That's right. It does. Yeah, it does. And I think, of course, the reason that I bring those things in is because I think they are supportive of what I'm trying to say. That it's important, I think, to understand where some of these ideas come from. Now, granted, once I do that, once anybody does that, one is very likely to get stuck in that place and to sort of get out from the main of this particular symposium. And that's always a risk. I think that's true. When I preach, of course, I don't do that. I don't run in stuff from the side because I think that doesn't help people pay attention at all. But when I'm teaching like this, I want to be sure that people see that the book of Job is not isolated. It is part of a very long and deep tradition, which the author knows very well, and is able then to bring all that stuff in with us. And for me, it enriches and deepens my understanding of the book. But I'm not trying to defend myself, Phil. I mean, obviously, I think sometimes people do find it difficult to follow when I do a lot of other things, bring a lot of other things in. I grant that. And thank you for that comment. It's a helpful thing to hear.
I have a comment, reflection on where you talked about where he says, let the earth not cover my blood, and how the dead speak from the grave. And I was thinking about a report on NPR today where they are uncovering a mass grave of children in the days of the boarding schools of Native Americans,
Right.
where they were trying to assimilate them and get rid of their culture. And it just was an example of how the dead are
Yeah.
speaking their truth from the grave at this moment.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Think of all those places. Ron Wilhelm here, my friend from Dallas, who has a house in Guatemala, and in Central America after the terrible civil wars that occurred in the 1980s. There were graves opened up in wells and in fields where suddenly the dead began to speak truth to how they were killed, how they were murdered by the hundreds, by death squads. So yes, absolutely, that the dead can speak and need to speak once they're allowed to speak. And I think this notion is more than supernatural in that case. I mean, it's quite natural to hear what the dead can teach us. And forensic anthropologists can certainly open up the possibilities for them speaking to us even now after decades after their death. Anything else? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Just a comment to Phil. Phil, all these sessions are recorded. So, and they're on the, if you go to our website where you log in, you can re-listen to any one of these, and listening to it again might help. Because, if you're losing the thread, listening to it again might help you understand it better,
Your advice is helpful. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but it may not be
My
there.
life, like yours, is pretty full, and even at this age. And to go back 2 or 3 times
You're very,
is
but if you find the time, you might.
yes, I understand. What I do miss, I'm going to say that I miss the breakout rooms. I particularly miss them on Sunday, since we're not going to have them anymore after church, which I always took as sort of a coffee time or coffee time after my particular church where I belong. And I don't know how anybody else feels. I found them, I'm missing my friends. There are in this group 6, 8, 9 of these people that I sometimes communicate with over Facebook, but it isn't the same. And I'm not sure whether this place is the place for it, but I'm going to put that back out there for Sunday mornings. If we could have a Sunday morning Bible class, that would be fun, where we could communicate back and forth. And now I'm going to hush.
It'll start again in the fall, Phil.
Yeah,
We don't do it in the summer.
yeah, we will do it in the fall, I'm sure. Yeah. Thank you for that, Phil. That's very helpful, though. It is. Thank you.
I'm
Okay, anybody else?
82. I don't plan that far ahead.
Okay, anybody else? Well, I think it's always when you're dealing with a book like this, which is cumulative, it adds itself up as we move from place to place to place in the drama, in the story. And we are clearly moving toward a confrontation with God. Job is, in so many words, has said that he needs to talk to God. The friends are not helpful to him. So now it's a kind of delayed confrontation. Sometimes when I read this book, I say, all right, enough already. I get all this. Now let's have a conversation with God. But we don't. And I think that's intentional on the part of the author. I think the author is delaying the confrontation with God because not quite everything has been addressed yet. That there are still issues that are in the community, I would suggest to you, in the exile, that need an address. And next week, I want to try to show you places where I think those issues are being addressed by friends, by perhaps another narrator, and certainly by Job, when in chapters 29, 30, and 31, which are, I think, quite important in the book, you will see that Job now is going to try to coerce, urge, lure God to come and talk to him, because that's the only place he's going to get any satisfaction, he thinks. Now, exactly what he's going to get, that's another question. We'll see what happens when God shows up, because that really is the key, when God shows up. Okay, well, I think that's all. We'll call quits for tonight. I hope to see you next week. It's a lot of reading to do if you have some time to do some of it. We'll have to go through rather quickly, of course, to get through material. But I think it'll be important for us to kind of get up to the point of seeing where God is going to show up. And then we'll spend the last week talking about the last 4 chapters, which are important, of course. Let's have a word of prayer.
Before we do, can you tell me the chapters that are kind of like the reading assignment for next week?
Yes, the chapters are beginning in chapter 22 and concluding in chapter 37.
Thanks.
The third cycle of speeches, the material that suddenly gets dropped in there, and then Elihu, and then that'll end that, and then we'll talk about what happens next the following week. Okay. Oh God, thank you for these opportunities that we have to be together around the word of Scripture, a word which has challenged people for a very long time. We don't know exactly what this author had in mind for us, but we are grateful for the energy and the passion and the challenge and the surprise of it all, so that our minds might be moved and in such a way that we can think again freshly about basic things in our theological and personal lives. We are grateful for those who have come. We are grateful for the friendships we develop. And we hope that in future we can find ourselves more with one another, and that we can hear one another clearly and speak honestly and straightforwardly, so that your word might be our word, a word of joy and peace and hope. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you next week.